The Vanguard's assault on the Draon homeworld had disrupted the planet's self-destruct sequence, but Captain Marcus Locke knew they weren't out of danger yet. The Draon, in their final act of defiance, had triggered seismic chain reactions that threatened to tear their entire world apart. The planet's surface was fracturing, vast fissures spitting molten rock high into the turbulent atmosphere, painting the sky a vivid, apocalyptic red. "Captain, the core destabilization has delayed the planet's detonation, but we're still detecting significant tectonic upheavals," Lieutenant Harris reported, his voice sharp with urgency. "The Draon won't stop until their world and everything on it burns." Locke's jaw clenched. He knew the Vanguard needed to retreat, but there was one last target to hit, one final strike to ensure the Draon could never rebuild their empire. "Lieutenant, scan for any remaining command centers or power nodes," Locke ordered, his voice steady, betraying none of the tension pulsing through his veins. "We'll make sure nothing is left standing." The crew was silent, their attention focused on the tactical screens as Harris pinpointed their target, the Draon Central Command, a massive underground complex nestled in the mountains of Nara's northern hemisphere. The structure was shielded beneath layers of rock and reinforced alloys, designed to withstand any assault. But the Vanguard wasn't just any warship. "Target locked," Captain Harris confirmed, fingers flying across his console, ready to unleash the main cannon. Locke's gaze never wavered from the tactical display. "Fire." The Vanguard's main cannon hummed, drawing power from the ship's core. A moment later, it unleashed a concentrated beam of energy, a searing lance of pure light that cut through Nara's clouds and struck the mountainside. The ground convulsed as the beam drilled into the rock, carving a path down to the Draon command bunker. The entire mountain seemed to implode, molten rock gushing from within as the fortress collapsed in a cascade of destruction. Below, the Draon command erupted in a final blaze of fire and smoke. Locke allowed himself a grim smile, a silent acknowledgement of the thousands who had suffered at the hands of this relentless enemy. "Captain, seismic activity is escalating," Lieutenant Harris warned. "The planet's crust is beginning to fracture. We have minutes, maybe less, before the surface starts disintegrating." Locke turned to his crew, his voice resolute. "All hands, prepare for emergency warp. This world's collapsing, and we're not staying to watch it burn." The Vanguard's engines roared to life as the ship angled away from the Draon homeworld, leaving behind the smoldering ruin of a once powerful empire. They had done the impossible, but Locke knew their victory would echo across the galaxy, a testament to humanity's will to survive. "Warp engines primed," Captain reported Commander Steele, his voice brimming with restrained relief. "Engage," Locke commanded, watching as the burning planet began to recede, swallowed by the depths of space. The Vanguard surged forward, leaving behind the Draon's dying world. As they disappeared into the stars, Locke cast one last look at the fading glow of Nara, knowing that they had turned the tide not just for Earth, but for every species that had suffered under Draon oppression. The stars stretched into infinity as the Vanguard emerged from warp space, the calm of the cosmos a stark contrast to the inferno they'd left behind on the Draon homeworld. The ship's hull was scorched, its shields flickering weakly, and every system was strained to the brink. Yet, for the first time in years, they had achieved what once seemed impossible. The Draon Empire was no more. Captain Marcus Locke leaned back in his command chair, his weary eyes scanning the bridge. Around him, his crew was in various states of exhaustion, some slumped over their consoles, others exchanging glances filled with the mixture of relief and disbelief. They had survived, but only just. "Status report," he ordered, his voice lower, roughened by the adrenaline crash that hit him like a tidal wave. Lieutenant Harris tapped his console, though his hands shook with the aftermath of the battle. "We're still running on emergency power, Captain. Shield generators are offline, and our primary weapon systems are non-functional. Hull integrity is down to 62%. He hesitated, then added, "But we're alive." A somber murmur rippled through the bridge as the reality of their survival began to settle in. They had faced down a civilization that had subjugated hundreds of worlds, and yet they had walked away. Locke felt the weight of it pressing on him. the responsibility he had carried for each and every one of them. He rose slowly, drawing in a deep breath. "Broadcast to all decks," he said. The crew looked up, sensing the gravity in his voice. When the communications link connected, he spoke, his voice carrying through every corridor, engine room, and med bay on the ship. "This is Captain Marcus Locke. Today, we did what no one thought possible. We faced the Draon Empire in its very heart and emerged victorious. Every one of you showed courage, resilience, and strength beyond what any fleet could demand. Because of you, the galaxy has a chance to breathe free once more." A silence filled the ship, a collective exhale, as though the entire crew was letting go of a burden they hadn't known they carried. Elsewhere on the Vanguard, in the bustling med bay, Dr. Liana Riker moved quickly between wounded crew members. The casualties were staggering. Some crew members bore plasma burns and fractures from combat, others, injuries from the brutal recoil of overloaded systems and weapons. Amid the chaos, Riker spotted Lieutenant Kira Davos, slumped on a bed, her arm in a sling, her face pale but determined. She had been in the thick of the battle, rallying crew members and keeping systems operational as the Draon ships bombarded them. "How are you holding up?" Lieutenant Riker asked, applying a sterilization band over Davos' burnt forearm. Davos managed a tired smile, still breathing. "But the docs back on Earth are going to have a field day with the injuries on this ship." Riker chuckled. "You'll have to get in line, Lieutenant. The bridge crew looks just as battered as everyone else." She glanced around, her gaze hardening slightly. "But we've survived worse, haven't we?" They exchanged a look of silent understanding of the traumas they had shared in this war. The Draon might be defeated, but scars, both visible and hidden, remained on everyone who had fought them. Back on the bridge, Locke was debriefing with his senior officers. Commander Steele, the tactical officer, was staring at the latest reports with a frown. "Captain," he said, his tone cautious, "we've received new intelligence. Early scans of Draon space show massive power vacuums, rival factions rising from the ashes of their empire." He looked up, concern darkening his eyes. "Their fall has created chaos across their former territories. We might have won, but we're looking at the possibility of a power struggle the likes of which the galaxy hasn't seen." Locke absorbed the information in silence. He knew that the Draon's defeat would leave scars across entire sectors. They had been an iron fist, brutal but predictable. Now, systems that had once cowered under their rule would be struggling to fill the void, some descending into lawlessness, others desperate to find stability in the chaos. "Steele," he said slowly, "we didn't set out to reshape the galaxy. But we're here now, and we're not going to leave worlds to fend for themselves." He leaned back, the weight of leadership pressing down on him. "Send a message to command. Tell them we're going to need humanitarian and security fleets dispatched across Draon space, and fast. We have to make sure our victory doesn't turn into another war." Steele nodded, his face hardening with a renewed resolve. "Understood, Captain." Later, in the solitude of his quarters, Locke allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. He poured a small glass of Terran whiskey, raising it in silent tribute to those who hadn't made it back. His fingers traced the engraved names of past captains on his desk, a reminder of the legacy he carried. A soft chime at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, schooling his expression back to calm professionalism. Lieutenant Harris stepped inside, holding a small datapad. "Sorry to disturb you, Captain. I just thought you might want to see this." Locke raised an eyebrow, but Harris handed him the datapad, where a message from command was displayed. It was a commendation, acknowledging the Vanguard and her crew's unparalleled bravery, but Locke's eyes narrowed as he read further. The commendation came with new orders to lead an expeditionary force back into Draon space, to ensure stability and monitor any potential threats that might emerge from the chaos they had left. Locke clenched his jaw. He knew what this meant. Their victory hadn't marked the end of the war. It was merely the beginning of a new phase, one fraught with the complexities of rebuilding peace. Harris seemed to sense the shift in Locke's mood. "Captain," he said hesitantly, "do you think we're ready? To go back, I mean." Locke's gaze hardened, the fire of determination flickering once more in his eyes. Ready or not, Lieutenant, we're what stands between order and chaos. The galaxy may have won a reprieve today, but there's still work to be done. He downed the whiskey, feeling its warmth spread through him, fortifying him for what lay ahead. Pass the word to the crew, he said, his voice steady. We've got a long road before us, and it begins again. The Vanguard slid through the void like a shadow, cloaked in the silence of deep space. Around them stretched the ruins of Draon space-scorched debris fields, derelict stations, the drifting hulks of ships left abandoned in the wake of the Empire's fall. Captain Marcus Locke stood at the viewport, his gaze hard as he took in the destruction, a silent testament to the cost of victory. Captain Lieutenant Harris called from the navigation console, his voice tense. We're approaching the designated coordinates. Long-range scans show multiple unidentified vessels in the area. Locke nodded. Any signs of hostility? Not yet, Harris replied. But there's a lot of chatter. Various factions broadcasting on open channels, all trying to assert dominance over this sector. It's chaos out there. Locke glanced at Commander Steele, who had been silent since they entered Draon space. Thoughts, Steele. Steele's eyes narrowed. It's a powder keg, Captain. These factions, the remnants of Draon warlords, opportunistic pirates, mercenaries, all of them will be vying for control now that the Empire's gone. They'll either see us as a threat or a prize. Locke folded his arms. Then we proceed with caution. Our orders are clear: observe. Establish contact with any factions willing to negotiate, and maintain stability. He paused, his gaze sweeping over his officers. But let's make one thing clear. If anyone fires on us, we're not here to play diplomat. A murmur of agreement rippled through the bridge. The Vanguard might have been tasked with peacekeeping, but every officer knew that peace in Draon space was a fragile illusion. Minutes later, the Vanguard received a transmission from one of the larger vessels clustered nearby, a patched-together ship bearing the insignia of the Vorak Marauders, a notorious mercenary fleet once employed by the Draon Empire. The face on the screen was gaunt, scarred, and hungry, belonging to a man who seemed to thrive on the anarchy now reigning over Draon space. This is Captain Malik of the Warhound, he sneered. Looks like the galaxy's greatest heroes have come to meddle in matters that aren't theirs. You don't belong here, Vanguard. These territories have new rulers now. Locke met Malik's gaze without flinching. We're here to ensure stability and prevent innocent worlds from being caught in the crossfire. If you're interested in a peaceful transition of power, we can talk. But know this: if you threaten the safety of any civilian settlements, we'll respond with force. Malik laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed over the comms. Stability. Is that what you call the Empire's corpse? These systems are ours now, Captain. We don't need you or your Terran command. Locke kept his expression neutral, his voice calm. Then perhaps you'll find that Draon space isn't as easy to control as you think, Malik. The screen went dark, leaving an uneasy silence on the bridge. Steele muttered under his breath, he's bluffing. They don't have the resources to hold these sectors. They're barely held together with duct tape and desperation. Locke nodded. But desperation makes people dangerous. Monitor their movements, Steele. If they make a move toward any of the bordering colonies, I want to know. As the Vanguard continued its patrol, a priority message arrived from Terran Command. Locke scanned the message and felt a tension grip his chest. A Draon official, part of the rebel factions who had long opposed the Empire's regime, was requesting a meeting. Well, Riker remarked with a raised eyebrow when Locke briefed her and the senior staff. I didn't think any Draon would be willing to negotiate after the fall of their empire. These aren't Empire loyalists, Locke said. The envoy is a representative of the Draon resistance groups that were forced underground when the Empire ruled. They claim to want a peaceful restructuring of Draon society. If they're serious, they could be valuable allies in stabilizing this region. Commander Steele snorted. And if they're lying, they could turn out to be as bad as the Empire itself. We won't know until we speak to them, Locke replied, glancing at Riker and Steele. Get the security detail ready. I'll meet with the envoy on the Vanguard's observation deck. The Draon envoy arrived shortly after, transported aboard under heavy security. Clad in simple robes, a stark contrast to the gleaming armor once worn by Draon officers, the envoy was a young Draon female named Senva. Her scaled skin was marked with ritualistic patterns, symbols of her loyalty to the resistance movement. As she met Locke's gaze, her eyes betrayed no fear, only determination. "Captain Locke," she began, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 silent battles. "I am Senva of the Draon Resistance. I've come to negotiate for peace." Locke studied her, searching for any signs of duplicity, but Senva's expression was unreadable, guarded. "Then let's start with the basics, Senva. What do you want from us?" Senva inclined her head, her gaze steady. "We seek aid in stabilizing the Draon worlds. Without the Empire's control, our people are vulnerable. We cannot allow marauders and rogue factions to exploit our worlds. The Resistance seeks to establish a council of unified leadership, guided by the will of our people, not by force." Locke raised an eyebrow, impressed by the boldness of her vision. "And you believe the other factions will agree to this council?" Senva's jaw tightened. "Not without persuasion. But with the support of the Terran Command and the Vanguard, they might realize that resistance is futile." Steele, standing just behind Locke, murmured, "Sounds like she's asking us to clean up their mess." Locke silenced him with a look. "Senva, we're willing to consider an alliance. But know this, we're not here to play favorites. If the resistance turns into just another dictatorship, we won't hesitate to intervene." Senva's eyes flared with indignation. "The resistance fought for freedom, Captain. We would sooner die than become the tyrants we opposed." Locke nodded, but the skepticism lingered in his gaze. "Let's hope your words hold true, Senva, for your people's sake." No sooner had the meeting concluded than alarms blared throughout the ship. Steele's voice echoed over the intercom, tense and urgent. "Captain, we've got incoming vessels, 6 of them, heavily armed. They're not broadcasting any identification, but they're closing in fast." Locke's gaze met Senva's, and in that instant he saw the shock and horror in her eyes. She hadn't expected this. If it was a betrayal, it wasn't of her making. "Bridge, bring us to battle stations," Locke commanded, his voice like steel. He turned to Senva. "If you want our help, prove it. Are these your allies?" Senva shook her head vehemently. "No, Captain. I swear on my ancestors, I had no part in this." Locke assessed her for a moment longer, then nodded. "You stay here. Security, make sure she doesn't leave this room." He strode out of the observation deck, his mind already calculating their next moves. The Vanguard was battered, but it wasn't defenseless. And if these ships were coming in for a kill, they would learn the hard way that the Vanguard was not a prize easily taken. The Vanguard surged forward, its thrusters roaring to life as it spun to face the oncoming ships. Red warning lights flared across the bridge as incoming plasma bolts glanced off what remained of their weakened shields. "Captain, shields at 40%, Harris shouted, his fingers dancing over the console as he rerouted power. "Return fire," Locke ordered. "Focus on the lead vessel. If we can take them down, the others might back off." The Vanguard's cannons roared, unleashing a barrage of fire that ripped through the void. The lead ship staggered under the assault, flames erupting along its hull. But the others pressed forward, unrelenting. "Brace for impact," Steele yelled as a missile struck their starboard side, sending the bridge crew sprawling. Locke gripped his chair, his voice fierce and unyielding. "They want to test us? Fine. Let's show them exactly what the Vanguard is capable of." The Vanguard limped through the dark, silent spaces between stars, smoke curling from damaged sections of the hull, engines sputtering as repair drones buzzed across the ship like fireflies. After the brutal ambush, the crew was exhausted but unbroken. Captain Locke knew they couldn't stay exposed for long, yet the fight for Draon space had only just begun. Captain Lieutenant Harris's voice cut through the quiet. "We've received a distress signal. It's coming from an old Draon listening post nearby. Judging by the frequency, it's from the Resistance." Locke exchanged a glance with Steele, who crossed his arms, looking unconvinced. A Draon distress call could be a trap. Locke nodded slowly, weighing his options. Could be. But if the Resistance needs help, they might be our best shot at stabilizing this region. Steele, get a tactical analysis on the station's surroundings, and if this is a trap, we'll be ready. The crew mobilized, tension simmering as they approached the listening post. The closer they got, the more they could see the scars of previous battles. Charred marks from plasma fire streaked the hull, and faint energy signatures showed that the station had been running on minimal power for weeks, possibly months. The Vanguard docked with the Draon listening post, its crew maintaining strict security protocols as they made contact. Inside, they found Senva waiting with a small group of Draon resistance fighters. The once proud warriors bore the look of survivors barely holding on, their clothes torn, weapons worn from constant use. Senva's expression softened as she saw Locke approach. "Captain, thank you for coming. We weren't sure you'd risk it." Locke gave a brief nod. "We didn't come here just for you. The peace of this entire sector is at stake. If you're serious about a stable government, we're willing to help. But we're not here to pick sides in a Draon civil war." Senva held his gaze, her eyes fierce with resolve. "We understand, Captain. But things have changed since we last spoke. The Warhound fleet has aligned with a new power of faction calling themselves the Blood Oath. They're led by a Draon warlord named Varric Kale, a brutal leader who believes only in conquest and bloodshed." Commander Steele tensed at the name. "Varric Kale? I thought he was exiled years ago." Senva nodded grimly. "He was, but with the Empire's fall, he's returned, claiming himself as the rightful heir to Draon space. He's rallied some of the most dangerous factions under his command. If he succeeds, well, you've seen the devastation he can bring." Locke folded his arms, processing the information. "What does the Blood Oath want with Draon space?" Senva's expression darkened. "Total dominance. They believe that only through strength can the Draon people rebuild. To them, resistance is weakness. Anyone who doesn't align with them is purged." Locke's jaw tightened. "Then we have a common enemy." As the Vanguard began strategizing with the Resistance, a transmission cut through the air, its tone laced with malicious amusement. A hologram flickered to life in the dimly lit control room, and there stood Varric Kale, his towering figure draped in crimson armor, eyes glinting with a mixture of arrogance and scorn. "Ah, the Vanguard," he sneered, his voice a low rumble that echoed through the room. "I've heard tales of your peacekeeping missions. But tell me, how much longer can your battered ship survive in Draon space?" Locke met his gaze without flinching. "Long enough to put an end to your ambitions, Kale." Kale laughed, the sound a deep, sinister chuckle. "You misunderstand, Captain. Draon space doesn't need peace. It needs strength. The Blood Oath will restore what the Empire failed to achieve: an unbreakable Draon dominion. Leave now, and I might spare your crew the misery of becoming debris in the void." Locke's eyes narrowed. "And if we refuse?" Kale's expression hardened. "Then your ship will be the first to burn." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Locke turned to his officers, his mind racing. "You heard him. Kale isn't just a warlord, he's got the power and the will to bring this entire sector under his heel. If we're going to stop him, we'll need every advantage we can get." Steele stepped forward, her voice low. "Captain, we've managed to reroute power to our weapons systems, but the shields are still barely at half strength. If Kale brings his fleet here, we won't last long in open combat." Locke clenched his fists, thinking quickly. "Then we don't fight him head-on. We turn this listening post into a fortress." He looked at Senva, who nodded, understanding his intent. "We can link the station's defenses with the Vanguard. It won't hold off a full-scale assault, but it'll buy us time." As they worked to fortify the station, Locke received an unexpected message. Captain Malik of the Warhound. His hologram appeared on the comms, his scarred face twisted with contempt. Malik growled. "I never thought I'd say this, but Kale's ambition is dangerous, even to us. If he takes control, the rest of us won't last long. The Warhound fleet doesn't bow to anyone." Locke raised an eyebrow, cautious but intrigued. "And what exactly are you proposing, Malik?" Malik scowled, clearly uncomfortable with the words he was about to say. "A truce. Temporary. We won't join your little alliance, but we'll help you hold off Kale's fleet. Once he's out of the picture, we go back to being enemies." Locke considered it, the weight of the decision pressing on him. Allies were few and far between in Draon space, and Malik's fleet could give them the edge they needed. "Agreed," he replied. "But make one false move, and the Vanguard will consider you hostile." Malik's smirk returned. "Likewise, Captain." The calm didn't last long. Within hours, Kale's fleet appeared on the horizon, their dark, imposing silhouettes blotting out the stars as they closed in. The Vanguard and the listening post, reinforced by the ragtag fleet of Draon resistance fighters and Malik's mercenaries, braced for impact. "All hands." Battle Station's Locke's voice echoed through the ship as the Vanguard readied itself for the onslaught. The first wave of Kale's ships surged forward, cannons blazing, their weapons tearing into the listening post's outer defenses. Explosions rocked the station, sending shards of metal and debris spiraling into space. "Return fire," Locke commanded, and the Vanguard unleashed a furious barrage, its lasers ripping through Kale's front line. Steele's voice crackled over the comms. "Captain, we're detecting a massive energy buildup on Kale's flagship. It's some kind of experimental weapon." Locke's pulse quickened. "Target that ship. We can't let them fire whatever they've got." The Vanguard pivoted, its cannons locked onto Kale's flagship. But just as they were about to fire, a sudden wave of interference scrambled their targeting systems. "Damn it," Harris cursed, his fingers flying over the console. "They've jammed us." Seeing no other option, Senva and her resistance fighters made a desperate move. They launched their ships directly at Kale's flagship, hoping to disrupt its power long enough for the Vanguard to regain its targeting systems. "Captain," Senva's ship Steele started, but Locke cut her off. "She knows what she's doing. We can't let her sacrifice be in vain." The resistance fighters collided with Kale's flagship, explosions rippling across its hull as their ships disintegrated on impact. In the chaos, the Vanguard's systems flickered back to life. Now Locke shouted, "Fire everything we've got." The Vanguard unleashed a devastating volley, its cannons tearing through Kale's flagship. The vessel shuddered under the impact, flames bursting from its sides as it began to break apart. But Kale wasn't finished yet. In a final act of defiance, he ordered his remaining ships to ram the listening post, hoping to take as many lives as possible in a fiery end. Locke's heart pounded as he watched the approaching ships. Evasive maneuvers. Get everyone out of there. The battle ended in a Pyrrhic victory.